Mrs. Lloyd, I just have a handful of questions. I was asking you.
Thank you.
You were giving some evidence about a seminar that Caxton held, and it's right to say that in the inquiry's consideration of documentation, there hasn't been any we haven't seen any reference to a seminar, and it looks instead like the beneficiary community were pressing for a seminar right up until the time that you left, and indeed information that we've had over the break from some of the core participants was to the fact that they weren't aware that a seminar had taken place. So can I just ask you to give us any more detail about when that could have been or where it could have been?
Well, I might have been mistaken, and if that is the case, I'm really, really sorry. But I was sure that we either had or were to have a seminar, because I know it had been raised by the Partnership Board and others. So if I've got confused between this and another trust, I really do apologise. I'm sorry. I've done my best to remember, but sometimes you can get confused.
So would this be fair to say that you had a recollection of attending a seminar, but you can't be sure that it was the Caxton Foundation? It may have been another organisation.
It could have been, yes.
You have said in your witness statement that you carried out appraisals of trustees.
Yeah.
What was the nature of the annual appraisal you conducted of trustees?
It was against their job description, which was not extensive, but basically that they were able to and felt confidence in undertaking their responsibilities along the lines of financial probity, objective setting and holding to account largely, and that we were able to have a spread of talents and understanding throughout the trustees, which would allow for good governance to take place.
And so would the particular trustees have responsibility for particular areas of governance?
Yes. Well, we had a collective responsibility, but there were certain trustees who had particular capabilities which were important to the governance of the organisation, like an understanding of HR practice, an understanding of communications, an understanding of finance and audit in particular.
And were there occasions during your tenure that you had any cause for concern as a result of individual trustees?
No.
How was it possible for Caxton to create a realistic assessment of the needs of the whole beneficiary community when Caxton were under the impression that many needy applicants were not making applications to it, and there was an impression that large parts of the beneficiary community had not been reached by Caxton at all, and that Caxton had no independent way of assessing the extent of charitable need within its potential beneficiary community?
Well, that's part of the complication with which we were faced. We did our utmost to try and calculate, particularly given the regular payment scheme, what the need of the population was going to be for a regular scheme. And as part of our sort of amending the dependency requirement, we knew that even with our support, there were some people who'd never be able to be independent of a grant-making organisation, and that had to be acknowledged. So knowing better from Skipton the number of beneficiaries that we were likely to receive requests from, we tried to look at the median of the requests that we received to try and calculate what if everybody who was entitled to receive a grant or regular payments, how much would that require in the long run? And that was the work we were doing when I left.
And so it would be as a result of those calculations and investigations, would it, that a case would be put to the Department of Health as to what the Caxton Foundation needed in order to meet the charitable need of the community?
Yeah, it would be based on the evidence we've collected, our analysis of the future size of the community, including those who would require regular payments at various levels. And then this would be the overarching future bid for the organisation.
So save for the bid for the regular payment, which was turned down, that work was in progress when you left?
Yes.
Do you know how the Department of Health arrived at the sum for the allocation? What was it based in any way on what the needs of the Caxton Foundation were, or was it based on what was available?
Oh dear. I don't think I can give an accurate answer to that because I wasn't part of the original negotiation. But I would have assumed that the most likely way they went about calculating it was based on the numbers that they believed were likely to make a claim, and the numbers that and the sort of size of the grant that we'd be able to give. And it would be something along those lines when the original allocations were made, but I was never party to those discussions. And that's why we needed to renew discussions with them, given our increasing evidence base of what was being requested by the beneficiaries. Not easy when we were underspending, but once we started to get the numbers that we expected registering with us, then we would have a far more credible set of arguments to place before the department.
How were you able to assess during your time at the Caxton Foundation whether it was successful in meeting its objectives using the powers available to it under the trust deed if you had not seen a copy of the trust deed?
Well, that was almost impossible to do, but we did have our objectives. And what we had to do is review those, and based on whether or not we had made progress on them, then our business cases for the next year would be constructed. So we had our objectives, and we worked on those to try and ensure that they were met. There were trustees when I first started who had seen that trust deed because they had signed it, and that was our initial guide.
So can I just take a moment just to check that I've got all the questions that
Excuse me.
So those are the questions I have from the call participants and their recognised legal representatives.
Yes, well, I just have a couple of questions. The first is this. At one stage in your evidence, you described that the beneficiaries were, in your words, very prudent in applying for grants, and that's why you were looking for a better way of getting money to them, money which you had and they weren't asking for, is I think what you were saying. So do you mean that knowing that they could get larger sums, they were nonetheless respectful of the fact you might not have all the money in the world to give them, and therefore asked for fairly modest sums? Is that what you're saying?
No, Chairman. What I intend to convey is that we did an annual census of potential beneficiaries every year. And when I got there, it wasn't being used, but we started to use it more in order to judge what the future needs of our beneficiaries would be. And that based on that evidence, we believed that they were applying for grants, but actually, given their level of income, they could have applied for more, and therefore we tried to help them with information on the sorts of things that could possibly be available to them if they wish to apply. So I do not imagine that they were taking the initiative to help us with our management of our monies, rather than we believed that there was a possibility that they were not accessing the support that they could have given their level of income.
So this was people who certainly weren't out for every penny they could get.
Well, given their applications, I wouldn't think that would be the case. No.
The reason I ask you that is there was a certain emphasis in some of the evidence we heard earlier about the Macfarlane Trust, which suggested that at the top there was a view that the beneficiaries of that trust would take liberties if they knew precisely what they could claim for. They'd all claim the maximum, but that wasn't your view of the beneficiaries of Caxton.
No, I think it was probably the alternative view.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. The second thing I want to ask you about was your description when you were appraising the trustees and the fairly light touch appraisal that, as you called it, I think, you said that you would hold them to account. Now,
yes.
You didn't give me details of what holding to account actually involved. What do you mean by that? How would you hold a trustee to account?
Oh, I'm
sorry?
What I meant was that the trustees had a variety of responsibilities, all of which could be assessed. And I went through a suite of questions under each of those competencies to get, I knew how I felt they had behaved and performed, but to have a conversation with them about what the requirements were and additional training if necessary, if I felt that they were scrutinising at, a too low a level, and that they needed to start to think about a different range of questioning, and to give them some coaching on that, and to ensure that they felt comfortable that their skills were being used effectively by us, and my responsibility was to maximise their skills. At that time, I was assessing trust boards for their competence. Well, it wasn't as hard-nosed as that, but I used the same basic framework that I would be using within the public sector to hold people to account.
Yes, thank you very much. Those are all the questions that I have. Ms. Scott.
Mrs.
Thank
Lloyd,
you,
do you wish to add anything to your evidence?
Only to say thank you very much for your courtesy and the helpful way in which you've asked the questions. My tenure at Caxton was 2 years only, which is actually quite a limited footprint in the life of the organisation, but I did work to make improvements to the lives that the beneficiaries could lead, although that sounds somewhat sanctimonious. And I have tried to recollect as far as I can to help this inquiry, which I think is important. And thank you very much for the evidence that you have provided to me, which was appreciated.
Well, I think really the thanks are due from us to you. At a fairly early stage in your evidence, you described how you got things done because you were impatient. Well, I think you might have had every right to have been impatient with this inquiry from the early stages, given the difficulties we had in maintaining a connection, which surfaced more than once. But
no, not at all.
The other thing which you might like to know is that you might be surprised, perhaps, to know by the number of witnesses that I have heard during the course of my career who, faced with a yes or no question, never actually answer yes or no, but say something around it without ever really answering the question. It's actually quite a relief to find someone who's completely different, who does give a yes or a no, or even on one occasion a don't know, and who's on the one occasion that you perhaps misremembered, you absolutely straightforward in saying that you might have done that. And that is, I must say, very welcome. So the precision and the clarity, the striving for accuracy which you've given, and the articulate way you've put it over has been most welcome to the inquiry. 2 years it may have been, but you've made it a lot clearer with a certain definite clarity, if I can put it that way, about it. And I'd just like to thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much for that.
Now, tomorrow we have Mr. Fish, do we?
Tomorrow we have Mr. Fish at 10 o'clock.
So, 10 o'clock tomorrow, Mr. Fish. Thank you very much.
Thank you.